now arrived at a powerful moment in this narrative. And it's a fascinating one too. It's Pink's second birth. And, well, why do I say that? It's because of the music, mainly. We can look at the lyrics, but I'm looking at the music. This entire piece is a repeat of the first song we heard at the beginning of the album, which is, we could say, the birth song. And even more than that, the titles are practically identical as well. Now, I think we can say that a lot of people experience more than one birth throughout their lives. Well, of course, all of us. We are not the same person at 20, at 45, or 60. We grow, we develop, we change, and are transformed in that process. Sometimes it is very gradual, while other times something acts as a catalyst and we change incredibly rapidly. Sometimes we know it is happening as it happens, and other times we can only recognize it in hindsight. And while we often feel a continuity and connection with ourselves through all our different phases of life, some of these changes can be so drastic as to make us a completely new person, unrecognizable to who we were before. And this is the kind of second birth that we find here with Pink. In fact, we can view all that has taken place up to this moment as the gestational period, so to speak. And now, in this song, a new person is born. That is, a new person is made manifest to the world. And the experience, and all that it signifies, is just as dramatic and impactful as the first one that opened this whole story. Now, this exploration of birth and what it implies is one of the primary subjects of this entire work. I've talked a lot about how this work focuses on relationships. But within that, we find some others, and birth is one of them. It's the first thing that meets us when we begin to listen to the album, isn't it? And now it returns again, this time with even more shocking results. And it's an incredibly fascinating moment in this narrative. Why? Well, it's because Pink becomes exactly what he has hated the most. Now, not only is the music itself practically identical to the opening of the album, but of course the title as well. Actually, there's one small detail in each, in the music and in the title, that is different. So let's start with the title. The only difference is that little question mark. At the beginning, it's a question. In the flesh? As if someone, either Pink or us, is not quite certain whether it's actually true. Is this what it is to be born? Is this the real deal? Is this an actual physical life? Am I really, actually living this experience? Or is it all my imagination? Well, as I've pointed out many times along the way, the bulk of this story takes place in Pink's mind. He's not actively living it as we witness it. Instead, he's sitting in his chair, staring into space, living his life over in his mind. And perhaps that is one reason why the question mark is there. Another possibility is that the question mark is communicating the idea that until one commits to a course, chooses their own path, that person is not truly living their own life, but merely existing in the one that was handed to them. So, Pink was born physically into this world, but he didn't choose the life that came to him, and we've seen along this journey how he hands off the responsibility and blame for its negative qualities to anyone but himself. And in this way, he's not actually living his own life. Or perhaps it includes another culturally embedded allusion to the religious idea that to be in the flesh is to be earthly, to have lost one's innocence, to be corrupt, even evil. And we can reasonably question whether that definition could be fairly applied to Pink up until now. Regardless, this time, as the title and song returns, there's no question. It's a statement. A fact. Perhaps there's a little bit of each of those concepts present here, although the idea that Pink is actually physically doing these things, or is he still living in his imagination, that's debatable. We'll leave that open. But certainly, he is committed to the things that brought about this incarnation of himself. And yes, I am choosing this word incarnation specifically because it has to do with being embodied in the flesh, kind of playing with words a bit. And it's also obviously true that this new character is horribly warped and evil. Pink's transformation into this evil monster is so radical that he's no longer the person he was before. Pink isn't well. He stayed back at the hotel. In other words, beware. This is not the Pink you became familiar with. Now, the second birth idea implies not only the birth of a new person, but also the death of the old one. Both cannot coexist. And there was a path that Pink followed to get here. What we could call the gestational period is the story we've been following all along this album to this point. And along the way, we've witnessed various figures and events from both childhood and adulthood, which have propelled Pink along his way. His father's death, society's rejection, Pink's teacher, his overprotective mother, his wife, all these have one thing in common. They acted as separators, as the means by which Pink was broken off from the rest of society, alienating him from those with whom he should have enjoyed meaningful, loving relationships. And being naturally sensitive, the impact these experiences had on him was deeply hurtful. He perceived that he was different from the rest, and each experience drove yet another wedge between him and the others. Imparted another spot to his skin, we could say, and all of which, added together, drove him to his self-isolation behind the wall. It's a natural instinct for survival. If something hurts, avoid it, cut it out of your life. But does it always accomplish what it should? Here, we are made to see one of the outcomes that isolation of this kind can bring. Now, there are, I understand, some other references to real-life events in addition to the one which hits us all in the face in this song, which is its clear mimicry of Nazism and even totalitarianism in general, but Nazism specifically, we pick that up when we watch the movie, even if we weren't able to really catch it in the album. Although it is there in the album, the whole story of World War II and Pink's father, it's built on that. So that is present in our face. But one of my supporters on this channel wrote to me saying that both In the Flesh and Waiting for the Worms lyrics are based on a real event of August 5, 1976, when Eric Clapton, under the influence of alcohol and maybe drugs, made a fascist-like rant in Birmingham. And I've also read that Pink Floyd, or we should say Roger Waters, because it was his brainchild, modeled it on pre-war fascist rallies in England. Now, regardless whether it is based on one specific event or inspired by several events such as these, this is an incredibly uncomfortable song. It's so deliberately full of phobic slurs and statements, and the entire attitude which comes through is truly frightening. I am aware that there is a significant discussion about whether or not Waters is an anti-Semite. And I can't comment on that myself. I'm not qualified, and I don't know enough about Waters. But if I ever meet anyone who tells me that this song is their favorite piece of music, or that it has a place on their favorites list, I have to say that I'm going to be incredibly wary. I will want to know why it is there. Because it is incredibly easy to take this song out of context and use it for exactly the kind of evil purpose that it is in context protesting, resisting against. And in fact, that's one of the misgivings I have about this song. In context, it's a powerful cautionary tale. But because it so easily works as a standalone song, well, let me just say that I, myself, as an artist, as a musician, would be uncomfortable is a mild way of stating it. Uncomfortable producing something that could be so easily misapplied. Now, does that mean that I don't have the courage to be a real artist, that I'm not brave enough to be entirely unbound when it comes to artistic expression? Perhaps, but I think this entire album is such an eloquent example of the frailties of human nature that we would all do well to think carefully about the side effects of our actions and even our artistic expressions. However, it is a very important song in this sequence. It's the moment in which we are made to face the truth of what happens when people take Pink's path. It is not a benign path. It is not merely a personal choice that affects only the individual on that path. No, it is a path which leads to the destruction of not only oneself, but also one's family, social connections, and indeed society itself. In other words, it is the path to hell. This song gives the parable of the wall teeth, and it lets us feel its rabid bite, and that is important. It makes visible the bitter end of Pink's strategy for self-preservation, and it exposes the very real danger that comes with making life choices based on selfishness and fear. It also shows us how important it is to persist in being vulnerable and open to love. To never lose hope, never stop believing that there are truly genuine, beautiful human beings out there, even if, like Diogenes, one has to go walking outside in the middle of the day with a candle in his hand, searching to find them. Poor tortured Pink, tormented by memories on one hand, feelings of abandonment on the other, cutting himself off from all who cared about him. He began to develop something new: hatred. His inner solitary confinement, self-imposed, killed the fragile, innocent, sensitive child that he had been, making room for a new persona, a real monster. And so we see in stark relief the truth that was first expressed in the happiest days of our lives. That is, the abused becomes the next abuser. This is the startling truth. Pink himself became exactly what tortured him in the first place. Nothing less than a Nazi, a totalitarian commander of the very system which his father fought and died in the fight against it, of the very force which took his father away from him, which, according to this story we've been following, that was the origin of everything. That was the first brick in the build-up of this whole story. It's what set him on this path from the beginning. He became Pink became the teacher picking on kids and punishing them for being who they are. He became his own overprotective mother, destroying his soldiers. He became his wife, abandoning his own people. Now, referencing the movie for a moment, watch Pink closely, and you will see. You will especially see the teacher in him, the way he moves, the way he speaks, the way he points his finger. Of course, this is a denouncement of any totalitarian regime. A sort of, we could say, Orwell's 1984 in just a few minutes, but it's also more than that. I'm reminded of a true story that Vlad told me about a certain prison in Romania during the communist era. And in that prison, one of their favorite tactics was to force the prisoners to torture those closest to them, their friends, brothers, sisters, parents, even their own children. It eventually became an international case study in psychology because, as horrifying and unimaginable and impossible as it may seem to us, from our vantage point, the truth is that after a while, many of those prisoners began to torture the others willingly, out of their own personal conviction. They became exactly what they hated. They became all that they had fought against. They themselves became part of the machine that put them there in the first place. Well, it's a bit different here because Pink was not forced against his own will. But the principle is the same. Pink abandoned love and all that it encompasses, and he surrendered himself to, turned himself into a prison of his own making. Locked behind his wall, thinking that he was protecting himself and keeping himself intact, but instead, he became exactly what he hated and feared the most. He became the very thing he ran from, the very thing he wanted to avoid. Why and how? Well, I see two main reasons. First, giving up love, which I've talked about, and second, isolation. We've discussed these at length over the course of this series. Well, one could argue that the second, isolation, is a natural consequence of the first, giving up on love. And maybe that's true, but for the sake of clarity in our understanding, for the sake of revealing the reality of this trap, I want to emphasize both of them separately. Pink gave up on the idea, on the principle, on the truth of love, on the experience. He gave it up entirely. He no longer believed in it, no longer even looked for it. And secondly, isolation. Because he no longer believed in love, he chose to isolate himself. And thus, Pink, the one who was once so soft and vulnerable as to ask, "Mother, will she break my heart?" is now shouting, "If I had my way, I'd have all of you shot." This is what Pink has chosen. Now, we might ask whether this entire song is merely a fantasy in Pink's mind or whether it's actually representative of what he's doing in his life, but it doesn't really matter, because either way, it's a serious problem. Now, musically speaking, there's not much new in this song that we haven't already explored in the Flesh, the one with question mark. But there is one significant difference worth noticing, and it happens in the introduction before we even get to the moment when the voice enters. That is the insertion of the ethereal choral ahs, which sound like this. wait a minute. Where did we just hear those? It was in The Show Must Go On. Okay, it's a different key, but it's the same blend of voices and the same 1/4 chord progression. It's clearly a reference to that song. And having just gone through that one in depth, this little musical quotation imparts a motherload of cross-references and allusions, in addition to the links between the two in the fleshes that we've already discussed. And being that we just came from that song, I won't repeat it all here. If you haven't watched that discussion, you can follow this link to find it. But what does it mean to find it alluded to here in this song, in this moment? Well, I see it as indicating that Pink is fully aware that he's chosen this path. He's had his time for reflection. He felt the nostalgic yearning for a more innocent time. Having done so, he has weighed his options, and in spite of it all, has decided that he wasn't willing to change his course. It reminds me of some lines from one of James Russell Lowell's poems. Well, he was both a poet and a diplomat, and he wrote a poem entitled The Present Crisis as a protest against the Mexican-American War. It's a long poem. Part of it says, "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife with truth and falsehood, for the good or evil side." And then a little bit later, comes back to that idea and says, "And the choice goes by forever, twixt that darkness and that light." We could say that Pink came to that moment of decision in The Show Must Go On. And now the results are coming to fruition. One of the really compelling qualities about the album performance is how we can really hear the frenzy gradually building in the voice, all the way from the first through to the last word. And when he arrives at that final word, shot, his delivery of it is so well done and so intense that even though we have felt the music taking us there all along the way, it still, in that split second, hits like a bullet on that word. And although the lyrics are in many ways quite simple, well, we could mine them for days without running out of things worthy of discussion. I'm not going to attempt to treat them comprehensively here, for that very reason, but a few points should be mentioned. First, isn't it interesting to notice that this is the first time since his wall was completed that we find Pink speaking or interacting with others outside of the wall? Well, of course, it's presented in the context of a concert. And in fact, that's a point especially worth remembering, particularly as it relates to what I've been saying about the irreversibility of Pink's decision, his commitment, and now the decision has passed, and that moment is gone forever, and he's pursuing and fully committed to this path. Remember this. This is a performance. In other words, it's rehearsed. And this is the moment in which I will argue that all of this in this song is going on in Pink's mind, not in real life. Because it's all a play. It's staged. This point becomes extremely important as we near the end of the album, because otherwise the last songs won't make so much sense. So keep that in the back of your mind. Keep your eyes and ears open for that idea in the coming episodes. One of the things I really enjoy about this song is the way that it, yet again, really plays around with this idea of the wall. In fact, I find the wall approached and explored here in this song in more ways than anywhere else we've met along the way so far. In some ways, it begins to feel a bit like a house of mirrors. Pink is born into his new persona behind the wall. And yet he is, for the first time since his wall was completed, speaking or interacting with others outside of the wall. Furthermore, he is calling out to all who bear any resemblance to his old personality, the non-standard, unique, artistic, sensitive, vulnerable. In other words, those who are not protected by a wall, or who choose to live their truth without isolating themselves. And he is calling for them to be placed up against the wall. Which wall? Pink's own wall. Just picture it in your mind for a minute. When was the last time we heard about someone other than Pink up against the wall? Hey you, with your ear against the wall, waiting for someone to call out, would you touch me? Actually, this is a rabbit hole we could go down and get lost in, and so I'm going to leave it for you to explore on your own. All of this, we know, was brought to fruition here in this piece because of an actual episode in real life when Roger Waters spit on a fan and the development of his thought after the event, both in regards to rock concerts in general, his experience as a rock artist, we could say demigod, and his political views. Now, while many of the slurs used in this song are really shocking and not something that we would want to be heard saying ever, the two I find most interesting are actually the ones that sound on the surface least offensive. The one smoking a joint and the one with spots. What is this one with spots all about anyway? Well, it's hard to avoid the traditions and stories embedded in Western culture, and I don't think we should try. Things like, the leopard cannot change its spots. It's the markings of what makes each one unique, what identifies the individual. It can be the unique characteristics that one was born with, or the markings acquired throughout life, either deliberately or by accident. And so, not only does Pink want to destroy the odd ones, the few ones who just don't fit in, he wants to destroy all who possess marks of individuality, who haven't been reformed and ground into the wormy mass, and who don't wear the mask applied to them. The ones who have resisted being lumped in with the rest, just as Pink once resisted, just as Pink loathes to consider. And the one smoking a joint? Well, okay, I should be careful not to lump everyone together or stereotype, but I understand that during this era in which this album was conceived and created, rock concerts were kind of synonymous with pot smokers. So now Pink is not just picking out the ones with their individuality intact. Now he's targeting the bulk of his audience. In other words, he's out to destroy them all. None of them are acceptable to him. Destroying his own, just like his mother. Which brings me to my final point. The danger of viewing any person, as being larger than life, of possessing what we might call celebrity divinity. And as much as I've been focusing on Pink himself, his own missteps, wrong choices, warped beliefs, and his responsibility, we cannot dismiss society's part in this story as well. After all, Pink's fans are there because they adore him. They worship him. I'm reminded of the poetic paraphrase of Martin Niemöller's speech. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I'll see you next time.